Hi, Julia.
Hi.
How are you? So, welcome. This is called Stop Believing These Five Wellness Myths. Do this instead. So, I wanted to introduce our dietitian, Julia. She is from my program, Find Food Peace. She takes care of all the dietetic part of it, the nutritional part of it. And I wanted to have her here because I hear so many times my clients tell me about diets, banned ingredients, eating for your hormones, superfoods, all the things. And I wanted to bring Julia in to help us clear the air.
Yes, and clear the air
Yeah.
we will.
Yes, definitely. Especially with you. I feel like you're so good with research and
Thanks.
clearing all of these myths. So I'm excited for this. I do want to say, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've been
Yes.
working with?
So I started practicing working with eating disorders in 2020. So this is year number 5 for me. And I've been practicing from an intuitive eating, health at every size, weight inclusive approach. And my background is in public health. So that's why research is so fascinating to me. I love getting into the research behind nutrition claims and really seeing like, okay, what's behind what the media presents to us in some of these ideas. So I
Yes.
think that's where a lot of this can be really cool to break down is like what we see, especially on TikTok now, are
Hmm.
tidbits of information and they don't get the whole picture. So I'm very into like, let's get the whole picture here. Let's look at all the angles, as many as we can. And then each individual can make their own conclusion from that research instead of one person deciding for all of us how we need to eat and move our bodies, etc.
I love that. Yeah. I think that too, like that's why I wrote eating for your hormones because I feel like I keep getting these little snippets and I'm like,
Hmm.
what? Like it
Hmm.
doesn't contain the different side effects, different
Hmm.
information. Why? Where
Hmm.
did this come
Hmm.
from? And stuff like
Hmm.
that. So I think and it's social media. I get that it could be
Yeah.
beneficial and it could be like, okay, like information. There is that good side of social media, but I think there's also that difficult side of social media that
Yeah.
makes it not as informational as it has to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think what can be tricky is when we hear words like hormones, our brains are like, oh my gosh, that sounds real. That sounds medical. Let me do something
Mm-hmm.
about that. Similar to how it kind of reminds me of when detoxes were, and they probably
Oh my
still are
gosh.
to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
a thing when it's like actually our livers and kidneys are actively detoxing for us. So a lot of these things that products that are trying to be sold or influencers who are trying to sell products are doing something that our bodies actually already do for us, which is really cool. But it can be
Yes.
confusing if you don't know that our
Mm-hmm.
bodies already have the mechanisms to do things that these products claim to do.
Yeah, that's true. And I think also because I mean, I have like a small background in nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I already know that. So I can go in with that filter and it's like
Mm-hmm.
easy for me to filter out the BS.
Yes.
But like you mentioned, like there's people that don't have that filter that actually like believe it. They're like, oh my gosh, I have to really
Yes.
do X, Y, and Z. If not, then whatever. And then that kind
Yeah.
of impacts your relationship with food and can lead to more binge eating, emotional eating, and this like chronic
Yes.
overeating.
Yes, because you're stressed. You read all of this and you get stressed too. You're like, oh my God, well, I can't
Hmm.
do anything right. So might as well not do anything, like, might as well throw
Yeah.
it all out the window.
Yeah. Screw it. This is
Yeah.
too hard. All right. So let's get to it. So let's go into the first one. Do you want to introduce which one it's going to be?
Okay. So we're going to be talking about 3 different types of fad diets. They kind of fall
Hmm.
into this category. So the first one I wanted to talk about is keto. So we've seen a lot about keto out there, its benefits and like what it's supposed to do for our bodies. There's a lot of different purported benefits, but I think the most recent one that's come up is a keto diet to prevent cancer.
Hmm.
So I wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit with the keto diet and just explain a little bit of why it was developed. So, the keto diet was originally developed to treat children who had epilepsy. So, it was originally like developed for a specific purpose. And then what happened was people were like, oh, well, if it works to help this one condition, will it have wider clinical impacts? Which is a legitimate question to ask. Like that makes sense. You would want to, if it works for treating one condition, could it work in other areas? So, one thing I will say though, when it's being used to treat children with epilepsy, is that those children often have like specialist dietitians guiding them through their meal plans. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
just something that they're trying on their own, which is also kind of where with some of these diets, we can really get thrown off is that most people don't have a specialist dietitian who can really monitor their food intake on a daily basis. So these diets are really hard to adhere to if you don't have a specialist dietitian on your team. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
say that as well, is that one of the components that makes these diets so ineffective is that they're just extremely hard to follow.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
after that, they were kind of taken over by mainstream media of like, okay, everyone should try the keto diet. And you basically, well, for those who don't know what the keto diet is, you're basically cutting out carbs. So you're primarily eating proteins and fats.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason that people thought that this could be a preventative for cancer is because cancer cells thrive off of glucose, which comes from carbs, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when we eat carbs, our body breaks that down into glucose, which provides energy to all of our cells, including cancer cells if we have cancer. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, what research found is that the keto diet can cause those blood sugar levels to decrease, which is claimed to starve the cancer cells of some fuel.
Mm-hmm.
But contrary to this common myth, the cancer cells can still grow on fats and amino acids. Amino acids
Mm-hmm.
are broken down from proteins. So even if you were to go completely carb free, you're still not going to completely stop the growth of cancer cells or kill them. And what research shows is that that keto diet may reduce the growth of cancer cells, but that's still a may. It's not something
Mm-hmm.
that they've found for certain is an effect of it. So it's just a maybe, which
Yeah.
I can understand people with cancer are like, you know what, I want to try everything that I can to slow the
Mm-hmm.
growth of this. If they want to try that, and if their doctor is prescribing that, then that's something that may work, but it may not. And so that's something we
Mm-hmm.
have to keep in mind with this.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
other thing to keep in mind with this research and with a lot of nutrition research is that a lot of it is done with animal studies instead of human research. And when it is done with humans, it's case studies as opposed to randomized controlled trials. So with
Mm-hmm.
case studies, we're just following a few individuals, maybe even one individual, and seeing how this type of diet affects one individual over a certain period of time. So it's really hard to draw like public conclusions from individual data as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So
could you go just a little bit,
mhm.
go into the difference between the case study and the individualized control?
Like the randomized control trials?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So a case study would be if we have a patient who has cancer and someone's like, you know what, if you want to be involved in this trial, we're going to prescribe a certain diet to you and follow you over time and see what your individual outcome is. And so they'll do that. Whereas with a randomized control trial, what that means is they're getting a random population of individuals and mixing them up and not telling them, are you getting this diet or are you not? Which is kind of hard to do
Yeah.
with diets in general. And that's why nutrition research is tricky for that purpose. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to do a randomized control trial because to some extent, people are going to know what diet they're on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a difference. And when we think about like the robustness of research, and this is kind of where public health comes in, is we have to take research and statistics classes, is that the best way to determine cause versus just correlation is through those randomized controlled trials. So when we
Yeah.
don't have those, all we can do is say, maybe this might work for someone. We can't say this for certain will work for
Mm-hmm.
everyone.
Yeah. It's like this is what happened with this specific person. And then somebody's taking that and being like, hey, this cures cancer. And you're like, wait, no,
Yes.
like that's not what we're trying to
Yes.
say. It's just that we got
Yes.
these results with this one person, and it
Yeah.
might be that it could
Yes.
be replicated with someone else, but it's not like a
Exactly.
guarantee.
Exactly, which is really cool. Like science in itself is such a cool field where we can say, like, let me try this first with one person. I have this idea. Let me see if I can
Mm-hmm.
try it with one or a few people, see how it goes. And then we can develop another type of clinical trial to see if it works with a wider group of people. So there are really cool mechanisms for us to grow research in this area. But what we don't want to happen is for one study to be published, that's a case study, and someone in the media or social media reads that and says, like, oh yeah, this is the next thing that's going to help prevent cancer, when really all that study showed was there is a limit in the growth of cancer cells in
Mm-hmm.
some individuals. So
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
where
Or in
that is
some
coming from.
animals.
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think with this might be a little bit of a side trip that I'm taking, but I
Mhm.
think when it comes to like these diets, right, that they have the research and they're like, oh my gosh, look at what happens with this one person or with this
Mhm.
three, I don't know, animals, whatever that is, but they're only taking research as like data and then creating headlines coming from it,
Yes.
right? But they're
Yes.
not really considering the psychological part of it. They're not really considering, do you actually need to go on the keto diet, or are
Yeah.
there other ways that you can actually approach your relationship with food and health in a way that's actually going to last you for your whole life instead of just
Yes.
finding a random way to lose weight fast because you
Yeah.
feel like that's going to improve your health and your like, I don't know,
Yes.
self-esteem. So it's
Yeah.
like different. It's kind of how you approach food because I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people too like they relate health and weight. So they're like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
must lose a lot of weight. Or maybe they have
Mm-hmm.
internalized fat phobia that they're not really aware of that's kind of leading this and they're just
Yeah.
using like health as like a way to kind of say that excuse to go into like these
Yeah.
diets, but
Yeah.
the psychological impact of the diet can also
Mhm.
be a huge side effect that a lot of people don't really talk about. And then
Yeah.
they blame
Yeah.
themselves and it's like, I'm doing something wrong because
Yes.
my aunt was able to stick to keto
Yeah.
and I can't do
Which
it.
most of the time your aunt isn't able to stick to keto. And that's the thing too with these
Hmm.
diets is that when they do research into it and they try to do a long-term study as opposed to like, oh, short-term studies are when they're looking like for a couple months, a couple weeks, and they're like, this works for weight loss and maybe the first 3 months. But then when they extend this research to like a longer period of time, even a year, most people regain the weight back because these diets do harm your relationship with food. And so you end up going back to the same old eating patterns that you had before you started the diet. So that's why we see that 95% of diets don't work is because that
Hmm.
it affects us psychologically more so
Yeah,
than all of these like maybe benefits of it.
exactly. The maybe benefits. I love that.
Yes.
Maybe benefits. We don't
Yeah,
know.
we're not sure. It's like, but we're sure that it will harm our relationship with food. So let's use that. Let's go off of
Exactly.
that. But yeah, and I think the other underlying piece of this, right, is that when we have a diet, like a keto diet, we can market a diet. Whereas getting back in touch with your body and listening to your body is not as marketable as
Yeah.
selling like a keto cookbook or keto supplements or like
True.
it's so it this when we have these new diets, they make money. And when we get bored with that diet, there's another diet that people can make money off of. Whereas when we're like, let's do something sustainable, that doesn't make a lot of people
That's
a
not
lot of
sexy. We
money.
don't want
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah. So that's the other component of this we have to keep in mind is like, is there someone that could possibly profit off of this diet? And if
Yeah.
so, that can be another thing that helps us question the validity of these diets.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also like, I guess the perception of somebody that goes on a diet, like the perception that people have about them or that they have about themselves, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing the keto. Like, that means that I'm
Mm-hmm.
like strict and that I'm like just taking
Mm-hmm.
care of myself and I'm doing so many things. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but it's been 2 weeks, right? Like, let's see if it lasts for 5, 10 years and then
Yes.
we can talk about it. But it's more also like that psychological part of it that it's like, okay,
Yes.
maybe you have this perspective of like, oh, I'm gonna go on a diet because that means X, Y, and Z. But if we
Disciplined.
really, disciplined, just
Yeah.
superior. But if you take like that
Yes.
step back, it's like, what's really going on?
Yeah. And I would argue that this might be a hot take, but I would say that like intuitive eating is it's a practice and it's a lifelong practice. So it's actually much harder to get into, to start, to learn how to do it, or to unlearn everything that we've been taught about food. It's actually much
Yeah.
more challenging than being like, oh, I have a shortcut answer. Let me do the keto diet. Like intuitive eating
Yeah.
requires that we talk about, like we go into our past and we learn about what's affected our relationship into food until this
Hmm.
point. And it's much more challenging until you really get the hang of it, but you're always learning in
Yeah.
intuitive eating. And it's something you have to kind of keep checking in with yourself about. And so sometimes I think we're also just looking, which justifiably so, sometimes we just want an easy answer of like, if I just do
Of
this,
course.
it's going to make everything easier. If I just follow this one way of eating, I don't have to ask myself any questions. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's just not the best way for us to
Sustainable.
eat. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
True, true,
Yeah.
true. Yeah. So we got keto.
Okay. We got keto. Let me see if there's anything else on keto. One thing I also found, just for people's information, kind of
Mm-hmm.
talking off of this cancer idea, is that so what ended up happening, there's further research after the fact to show that when individuals who had cancer, well, let me just talk about the downsides too, also for people with cancer, just to name that.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about how restriction in general can harm our relationship with food. For individuals with cancer, restriction is also doubly harmful because they need a ton of food and energy to
Mm-hmm.
fight off this disease. And so what we don't want to happen is further weight loss in someone who's
Yeah.
fighting cancer, which a keto diet, because it's so difficult to follow, some individuals who have cancer who do that might lose weight, which is actually like contraindicated for someone with
Yeah.
cancer. So I
Yeah.
want people to keep that in mind as well.
Good.
Um, and the last thing is that most recently, what a researcher found when looking into this is that while keto may lead to the starvation of some cancer cells, what ends up happening is that the cancer cells that are detect that there's not enough glucose to exist comfortably in that cell, they end up escaping. And so we see a higher rate of cancer metastasis. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but
Mm-hmm.
basically the spread of cancer cells is more quick versus what the
Mm.
keto diet is supposed to do is slow the tumor cell growth. But what ends up happening is because those cancer cells aren't getting the glucose, they spread out to go look for it. So
Mm.
this one study found that keto diet
Yeah.
actually causes the spread of those cells. So that just goes to show like there's the research is evolving. The research is
Yeah.
evolving. So we don't want to make any lifestyle changes based on something where there's still a lot of research to be done too.
Yeah. I think that also shows what we were talking about of like the headline news. Like somebody could take that and be like,
Yes.
keto causes cancer to spread rapidly. Be careful. Don't do
Yeah.
this. And then it's
Yes.
just like ringing the
Yes.
alarms.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So we don't
Yeah.
want we don't want to ring alarms. We just want to know that
Yeah.
the research is evolving. Don't make any big changes in your eating patterns because of one thing you read.
Yeah.
Be curious.
Be informed.
Yes, as much as
Yeah.
you can be, because I think what we were talking about earlier is that, we have a background in nutrition, so it's easier to kind of keep an open eye. But if you are curious and you're not sure how to find the answers, one, like find people who do know how to do this research.
Mm-hmm.
So get an expert, watch these videos, like be curious in that way. Try to find people who can do that research, who have that background to help kind of translate nutrition
Yeah.
research
Not just
into
an influencer.
yes.
Sorry. But yeah.
Yes, true. So with intermittent fasting, similar to keto, what we see is that um, research supports this only in very short-term studies. So in
Okay.
the longer term studies, what we see for intermittent fasting is huge dropout rates, which you can guess why people drop out because it's really
Yeah.
hard to do. It's not sustainable. Again, this type of research was more based on short-term individual numbers rather than overall and long-term health benefits, and lots of animal studies. So again, very little human research here, and mostly animal studies, short-term
Mm-hmm.
research, just stuff that we can't really translate into applicable information for us.
Mm-hmm.
So intermittent fasting, let me just talk. I'm going to do a quote I found from this one dietitian who was writing about it, which I think also speaks to how intermittent fasting affects our relationship with food. So restricting your eating to only certain times during the day ignores your body's needs, leaves you undernourished, and could cause the pendulum to swing to the other extreme once you do have permission to eat. This
Yep.
type of dysregulated, haphazard, and chaotic eating pattern negatively impacts hormone balance, with more on that to come, immunity, digestion, and sleep patterns. So like if you're not eating regularly, all of those things go out of whack. And so
Mm-hmm.
basically what she's saying is that when we're engaging in intermittent fasting, which if anyone who's tuning in doesn't know what that is it can kind of take different shapes, but usually you have set hours in your day where you're allowed to eat. So I think one I hear a lot of is like skip breakfast and start eating at lunch and then stop eating at a certain time, which we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Only eat within this period of time. But one, that's really hard to comply with for a long period of time because, yeah, sometimes you wake up and you're hungry for breakfast right away. And if you're going to
Yeah.
deny yourself until lunchtime, you're going to be super hungry at lunch and then wonder why your eating feels out of control because you're really
Hmm.
hungry. So it does more harm than good. And there's no research to show us that there are any long-term benefits of it.
Yeah. And I think also it's like, because I think it was Andrew Huberman, which I love his research and like his
Mhm.
podcast and all of that. It's like 3 hours
Mhm.
long and I'm like listening. But I think also in one of the clips that I saw, I think it was him. I hope I'm
Okay.
quoting it correctly, but he was like intermittent fasting really improves focus and just all the benefits, right? Okay, that's
Mm,
fine. It
mhm,
could be that for some people there are some benefits, maybe short-lived, as long as you're able to like do it, whatever that is,
mhm,
even if you're able to
mhm,
do it. But
mhm,
again, if you struggle with your relationship with food, if you've been on diets you gain the weight back and you blame yourself and you feel out of control when you eat, this does not
mhm.
apply to you.
Yeah.
Like this
Yes.
isn't about you, but it's
Yes.
because you have to see the different things that impact somebody's relationship with food. And that
Yeah.
is when you eat enough or when you don't eat enough, when you deprive yourself, that's going to impact your day
Yeah.
to come or the next few days. Like if you don't feel out of control that night, give it a few days and see how
Yeah.
this really impacts your relationship with food.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like I
Totally.
wish everyone talking about like diets and things like that had like a little asterisk of like,
Yeah.
okay, but if you struggle with food, like this might not be for you.
Yes.
Just for
Yes.
somebody to
Yes.
be like,
Yes.
oh, okay, well, it's not my fault that I can't stick to this. It's just that they're telling you
Yeah.
not to eat for 20 hours.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
maybe not 20, but
Yeah. I know what you mean. And yeah, for some people, I think there's always caveats. Like some people, perhaps your friend, and this is always what happens is there's anecdotal evidence of like, I
yeah.
have this friend who doesn't eat breakfast and he's never ate breakfast and he's had like a perfect relationship with food his whole life. That's an anecdote and that's wonderful for him. You don't need to tell him to go eat breakfast. He's doing his own thing. That's fine.
Hmm.
And like we have to kind of weigh all of the pros and cons of this. If
Hmm.
intermittent fasting is going to lead to more disordered eating, then that's going to be more harmful to your health overall than any dietary change that you try to make.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the long term versus short term. If long term,
Yes.
you want to feel cool, calm, collected, able to see food as neutral,
Yeah.
able to learn about nutrition and how to apply it, beautiful. If you want a short-term thing, okay, that's fine. You could do it, but just have that expectation instead of like blaming yourself, I guess.
Yes. Yes. Have that
Yeah.
expectation that maybe in the short term it will work, but it's very difficult to do long term for the average individual. And the last piece of research I found on this was that so there was a randomized one year trial, so a little bit longer period of time. And what they found, because a lot of people go into intermittent fasting either for weight loss, like you've named, or health outcomes, like the benefits of doing it. But through that 1 year trial, they found that intermittent fasters didn't lose more weight, and it also didn't improve various markers of health any more than it did for the control group. So this suggests it's not really a miracle cure.
That's a cur. It's true though.
Yeah.
It's not
So
like this thing that's just gonna fix it all.
yes, which I think this goes back to our main point is that it makes sense that all of us want to find like that one thing, but there's not just one thing, there's not one cure for our relationship with
Mm.
food. So just reiterating that.
It just makes us human. Like we do want like the thing that's gonna
Yes.
solve it, and we do feel like with these headlines and snippets of information, we're kind of seeing it and be like, oh, okay, well, it sounds good. Let me try it out.
Yeah.
But just take a little step back and be like, okay, if I really want this long term, am I gonna be able to stick with this
Yeah.
for, I don't know. I was gonna say the rest of my life. I don't know if that's like the
Yeah,
plan,
that's
but
kind of like that. I think that's important to name is that's the expectation with most of these diets is that it's not like, okay, do intermittent fasting for a year and then you can eat however you want. It's like
yeah.
you have to take that on as if you were going to do it for the rest of your life. And doesn't that sound miserable to like never have breakfast again?
I know. You can't go to brunch. What are you
Yeah,
gonna
yeah,
do?
yeah. Whereas, like, if
Yeah.
we think about it, a lot of people have in mind, I'll do intermittent fasting for a little while and then I'll start to eat intuitively. But it's like you can just start eating intuitively now and get a head start
Hmm.
on that. And that, because that's a hard thing to do as well. Go to
Yeah.
that now. You know, if you want to have a healthy relationship with food, start there instead of starting with the diet and then thinking it's going
Yeah.
to transition into intuitive eating.
True, because it doesn't, well, I guess I don't want to speak for everyone, but it usually doesn't happen naturally, right? You're gonna do
Yeah.
intermittent fasting or keto, maybe you feel a little bit out of control and be like, oh, when I end this, then it'll be fine. And it's like, wait, no, you actually
Yes.
need a plan because
Yes.
you've been depriving yourself, and it's gonna be weird when you're actually gonna be like, oh, well, now I'm supposed to eat naturally. What does that even look like for me?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Because it's not like that's not, you're right, like kind of a I don't want to say normal or appropriate way of eating, but it's just not what's normalized in our society, right? It's not like we're just
Yeah.
getting bowls of pasta sauce and that's what's normal.
Mm-hmm.
No, we're getting pasta and pasta sauce. So it's a way of eating that requires quite a bit of effort. And then
Mm-hmm.
you can get burned out on that effort. And then when you're like, I just want to go back to what was easy and
Yeah.
ordering the same types of foods that my friends eat, that transition can be really difficult if you've been dieting for such a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Okay, so should
Yeah.
we talk about eating to balance hormones?
Yes. I'm
Okay, so
excited for
this
this
is
one.
next. Yes. So, eating to balance hormones. I read this article on it, really cool, and they brought up that this idea of eating to balance our hormones has two red flags of pseudoscience, which I love that term pseudoscience. It's something we can kind of all look out for, which is sounds too good to be true. And it's built from like pieces of truth, but kind of pieced together in a way that doesn't make sense. So they're taking bits of
Hmm.
information that's like, yeah, that does make sense. There's a legitimate concern there, but piecing it together with something else that doesn't quite. So let me
Hmm.
dive in. Let me dive in.
Yeah.
So there are some hormonal abnormalities that are legitimate medical concerns, like PCOS, right? There's
Hmm.
that type of condition where your hormones are off balance and you have to get treatment for it, but that's a specific treatment that you need, again with the support of a specialized dietitian, specialized medical provider. Like there are conditions like that where your hormones are affected.
Hmm.
But these are not the type of conditions where like an influencer can sell you a product and that's what balances your hormones, or you can eat in just a certain way and that's going to balance your hormones. And oftentimes when we see influencers talking or about hormone imbalance, instead of those types of conditions, they're talking about more like a broader, vaguer sense of imbalance. They're like, oh, just like your hormones are imbalanced over the course of a month, they can go off track. And it's like, well, yes and no. Like, yes, especially for individuals born as female, is that yes, we have menstrual periods, and so our hormones do shift like over the
Hmm.
course of a month, but it's not something that's wrong. Like that's
Yeah.
part of our our
Yeah.
body's natural process is like, yes, our hormones shift. And honestly, sometimes we do change the way we eat according to those hormones because before you get your period, you may be craving certain types of food, which is normal. And so it's normal to change how you eat in that way. But when you try
Hmm.
to manipulate your eating to be like, I have to balance my hormones, there's no evidence that supports a balancing that your body doesn't already naturally do, if that makes sense.
Like basically saying the headlines are telling you that if you eat this way, the food will have an impact on your hormones.
Mhm, mhm,
When in
mhm.
reality, your hormones are going to be balanced regardless. And if not, it's not going to be managed or manipulated by food.
Exactly,
Okay,
exactly.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like no legitimate medical support behind if you eat X food, it's going to do this to your hormones, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. There's
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
there's nothing there to support that. So to say, oh, like what I've been seeing is, okay, during this part of your menstrual cycle, you eat this and you exercise in this way. there's no actual science to support that information of like
Yeah.
changing how you eat for hormone balance. Um, and another part of this that's super interesting to think about is that oftentimes this content specifically is targeting women of like,
Yeah.
yes, this is something women have to deal with, but men also have hormones. And so it's
Yeah.
interesting that it's
Just
targeted
us.
to, that's another red flag of like, why is this disproportionately like marketed towards women when like male bodies also have hormones that need regulation? But again, like we assume that men's bodies are okay. They can do that. Their
Yeah.
bodies are okay. They can balance their
They
hormones.
function. The body
Yes.
can function. It's fine.
Yes.
Ours, we have to really manage it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So what like a lot of dietitians kind of see through that is this is just another stand-in for women needing to focus so much on thinness and also like
Yes.
usefulness. Our bodies just being like a vessel of usefulness of if you have these hormonal changes, you need to do something about it now so that you can be a useful, productive member of society where it's like, actually, when you're about to get your period, it's okay if you need to
Yeah.
sit on the couch with a heating pad. Like that's okay.
Hmm.
So
It's so
oftentimes,
true though.
yeah, like
It's like you
these,
can't. You have to do this so that you can be fine. And it's like,
yes,
no, actually, you're okay. You're
yes,
fine.
your
Like,
body's
calm it down.
okay. It's been doing this for centuries. It's fine.
Hmm.
You're good. Again, like it's a lot of times like, it's just influencers trying to kind of and I don't think it's bad intentions. I think they're
Right.
probably well intentioned of they want to help people feel better and there's just not the science to back it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you mentioned two things came to mind, but I think when you mentioned like we've been doing this for centuries, like our bodies have been doing this for
Mhm.
centuries, like what um how do you say it? Like what an amazing situation that we have so much time so like available to actually be like, oh my gosh, what am I going to eat for my hormones? Because now I'm able to have so much free time to hyper focus on
Yes.
my hormones.
Yes.
Do you know
Yes.
what I
Yes.
mean?
Yes. Yes.
But then I also think
And
of like the mothers who are like have
yeah.
like so much to do and so much that they can focus on
Yeah.
other than, oh, I need to hyper focus on this now. And it's
Yeah.
like, no, you
Yes.
don't.
Yes. Which I think speaks to just diet culture's focus on asking again this disproportionately affects women to think about how they can maintain their bodies whatever that maintenance means, right? Of
Mhm.
if we are spending so much time focused on balancing our hormones, losing weight, staying toned, um,
Yeah.
keeping up with the diet, then we don't have
Being high
time to,
functioning.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, we don't have time to think about systemic issues that are affecting women more than men. We don't have time
Yeah.
to think about systemic issues just generally and like create social change when we're so focused on like the minutia of what our bodies are doing and what our bodies are not doing, like focusing on the things that we don't trust our bodies to do. Like it's
Yeah.
also can be really sad to think about the fact that like we've gotten to this point of distrust in our bodies that we think they can't balance our
Yeah.
hormones for us. Like
Yeah.
no, they can. They're good. They're really good at doing
And even
that.
like mistrust, and I was like, this is something that I work a lot with my clients. It's like the mistrust in yourself. In
Yeah.
I think diet culture is like a symptom
Yeah.
of that mistrust in
Yeah.
yourself. Like
Yeah.
now I can't eat
Hmm.
without
Hmm.
these rules. Now I can't be worthy if I don't look like this. Now I
Hmm.
can't be high functioning because I'm tired because of my period. And it's like, wait a second. Like there's so much rewiring that has to
Yes.
happen
Totally.
when working in your relationship with food and body image.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly it. Is like there's so many beliefs that are deeply ingrained in us of like you said we have to be high functioning all the time, we have to be in thin bodies, we have to be um even like presenting as such. So I think you talked about this a little bit earlier of like you have to be able to talk about the diet that you're on and the ways you're
Yeah.
pursuing clean eating to prove your worthiness, right?
Yeah.
Of like even belonging in certain communities. And so I think that's a large part of it is we become so disconnected and distrustful of our bodies because of all of those things that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember a past client being like, okay, so now like I'm not gonna follow any diets or whatever. And she's like, I don't even know what I'm gonna talk about with my family. I'm like, I know. That's why you've probably
Yes.
been grasping onto it for so long. Because there
Yes.
is this huge void of like, wait, identity, connection. Like, how
Yes.
do I seek that now? How do I connect with myself and with
Yes.
others if I don't have
Yes.
this? And
Yes.
that's a
Yes.
huge part
Yes.
of it.
Yeah. Which can be daunting. It can be
Yeah.
daunting to think about like when you are someone who no longer adheres to diet culture, there does become less to talk about in that realm. I will say,
Yeah.
like, then it gives you space. It can leave a gap, but it gives you space to find other things to learn about and be curious about and make the world a better place at the risk of sounding
Yeah.
cliche.
To
But
find
like,
you. What do you like?
there's more time to
That's
do that, which
it.
can be scary. And I think that's why
Yeah.
sometimes in a way diet culture provides this like safety net of if I'm talking about and looking up ways to change my body, then I don't have to think about the fact that I'm struggling with my identity right now, you know? So
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
I think how it ties together.
Yeah. What about like you mentioned PCOS? Is that the
Mhm.
same thing as eating for your hormones? Like how does that fall under the same thing?
So, not necessarily with something like PCOS or when people have like hypothyroidism, those are medical conditions. So, if
Hmm.
you think you have PCOS, that is something that can be diagnosed by a medical provider. And
Okay.
then there's usually different aspects of treatment that you would undergo if you have PCOS, which your doctor usually work with an endocrinologist and they'll
Hmm.
offer different medications. When you're working with a dietitian, they'll talk about ways to make sure your eating is regular, for example. So, with
Hmm.
PCOS specifically, if we're kind of getting into the weeds of it, it's something where you don't want to be engaging in like a highly restrictive diet because your body needs to have a more constant supply of glucose. So, with a dietitian, you'd work on having a more regular, consistent relationship with food and making sure that you're including all components, carbs included, because there's a
Hmm.
lot of another myth is that if you
Yeah.
have PCOS, you should cut carbs. Absolutely not. That's not part of the recommended plan. And there's a
No.
lot of good, yeah, there's a lot of good dietitians to follow who, if you have any sort of like medical condition around hormones. So for PCOS, I believe her name is Julie Duffy Dillon. She does a lot on um, she's a dietitian who does a lot on PCOS specifically. So she has a lot of resources and tools to use when kind of treating that condition, but it's treated as a medical condition versus like just change the way you eat and
Yeah.
take these supplements and this will be great. You know,
Yeah.
there's
Just don't eat this and you're good.
yes, if you have a condition like that, you need support more than just your TikTok to treat
Yeah.
it.
That's a good point.
Yes, 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 yes.
Don't just go to TikTok and start to like test
Yes.
things out.
Yes. Especially because with like outside of PCOS, so something like hypothyroidism, there are medications that people need to
Mm.
be on. So that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing that often happens too, I will say with eating disorders, like with anorexia, for example, we'll see a lot of hormone imbalances from food restriction.
Yeah.
So if you have an eating disorder and you have like your lab results come back all over the place, we don't want to go to more restrictive diets to
Right.
treat that. A lot of times,
Hmm.
hormonal imbalances can be from being malnourished. So, similarly, like what one hormonal imbalance is losing your period, right? If you don't have
Hmm.
enough hormones to have your period, you have amenorrhea. And so
Hmm.
you're not going to treat that with a restrictive diet. You need to treat amenorrhea with eating more consistently and adequately. Like you actually
Yeah.
need to work on eating more to treat that condition. So a lot of the times when we do have these hormonal conditions, there's legitimate medical treatments for them that don't involve like the kind of biohacking of our systems to try to figure out what's going on. It's like, no, there's often a very clear way to help treat
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the side effects that people don't see of not eating enough. And a lot of times it's
Yes.
so normalized to go on these fat
Yes.
diets and not eat enough and overexercise. And oh, I worked out an
Yes.
hour every day. And it's like, wait, but that also has its negative side effects.
Yes. 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 Yes.
It's
Yes.
also
And I
not
think
eating for your hormones.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think one thing too that with dieting generally, sometimes when people start a diet, they'll be like, I felt so great when I first tried this diet last year. I don't know what happened. Like, I really felt great when I did this. And it often is because when you're first trying a diet, you become more intentional about your food of like, okay, well, I know I need to eat at this time. So I'm going to make a point of eating it at this time. And that intentionality can feel really good, but you can have intentionality without a diet. And
Yeah.
that's where the sweet spot is. Right. And so that's one thing too with any of these diets is people are like, well, I did feel really good for the first couple months of it. Like, how do you explain that? And it's like, yeah, because you actually started paying attention to your body, maybe not in the way that was sustainable, but you started paying attention to the way you ate and the way you moved, and that made a difference. But the diet or the movement plan itself is not what made the
Yeah.
difference.
Yes. Yes. And then the psychological effects that happen after that, which is like self-blame,
Yes.
shame, all of that
Yes.
also happens of
Yes.
like, oh, I wish I
Yes.
could have just stuck to that. And what does that mean about me that I couldn't? And then comparison.
Yes. And then that just gets you into the spiral of like, it must be
Mm-hmm.
me. It's
And then
always
I
the diet
must
then.
solve it with
Yes,
another
with another diet.
diet. I must be more disciplined.
Yeah. This time it wasn't about keto, but it's now about hormones. And now I've got the
Yeah,
magic. I've got the magic, I
that's
don't
gonna
know.
do it.
Yeah, key.
Yeah. The magic cur.
Yeah, cur. It comes back.
The cur. All right, that was so good. I feel like that was so helpful and
Okay, good.
for lack of a better word, I don't know if this is even a word, informational.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course.
Okay.
And if anyone watching this video has like, what about this or but this, put them in the
Mm-hmm.
comments because
Please.
we love, I was going to say we love butts. We love those type of
Yes.
butts.
Yes. We love butts and we love to know what
Yeah.
you're thinking and
Yes.
we love to talk about these things, I
Yes.
feel. And
Yes.
I think a lot of times when people come up to us or even clients, it's like,
Mhm.
I hear you.
Yeah.
We know why this is happening.
Yes.
And let me inform you about
Yeah.
the why.
Yeah. And sometimes, like, one thing I notice is that even as a dietitian, you can't know all the information that's out there. And
Hmm.
so when people are like, but I heard this, sometimes I haven't heard that. So I need to do my own research of like, and that's one thing I'm always willing to do is I don't shut down anything on the first time I hear it. I'm like, let me just see first what there is out there about it. So if there are things that you're like, but I heard from this angle, this might be
Hmm.
effective. I think it's always important to do our research for things that like, even if on the surface we're like, that sounds like a red flag. We still need to do research into it to better understand why, if it is, and if not, like how do we implement it in a way that doesn't harm your relationship with food?
Yes. I was just gonna say that. I think because we don't know, at least me, like I'm not the expert in your life. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's gonna work for you. I don't know what's
Mm-hmm.
not, but all I
Mm-hmm.
know is that we can really put some thought into, okay, let's say that this is the big thing and this is something that you're interested in. How is that going to impact your relationship with food? Because we know that
Yeah.
that's something that you struggle with. That's
Yes.
it,
Yes. 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 Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
let's say it worked for
Exactly.
20 people, everyone in your life is doing it, whatever. Okay, but what about you? You're
Yeah.
different. We know that these are your struggles, and how do you feel like that's going to impact it? That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Let
The
that get
example
in.
I like to think of is like we know, for example, that blueberries have antioxidants. So
Hmm.
you might have this health goal of I want to eat more foods with antioxidants. That's great. That is a wonderful health goal to have. Thinking about it of like maybe I can include blueberries in my next yogurt bowl. Like maybe that's something I want to do. What we don't want to happen is where it becomes rigid of like, oh my God, I have to eat blueberries every week for my health. And if I don't, then I'm a bad person because I clearly don't care about my health. Like
Yeah.
that's where we
Yeah.
start taking a left turn. Whereas it's, yeah, if you're like, I actually want to start working this year on including some more berries. That's great.
Yeah.
That's like a great goal to have for yourself. You just have to know when that goal becomes a food rule and when that
Hmm.
rule then goes to the shoulds, which brings up shame, which
Yeah.
then, increases our risk of disordered eating.
Yeah. Or even like, oh, I didn't have blueberries today, and then that becomes a trigger for binging. Like, oh, screw it.
Yes.
I already like broke this
Yes.
rule, like you mentioned, then I'm just gonna
Exactly.
like go
Yeah.
ham today and not care
Yeah.
about it. And
Yeah.
I'll eat the blueberries tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. That's where we can hold both of they can be beneficial for us, but blueberries can also be harmful if we attach so deeply to needing to have them every day. So I think
Yeah.
that's where the juicy part of this is, no pun intended. Um,
Blueberry juicy part of it
yes.
is. Yeah. All right. So that was a part of like fad diet. So if you have
Yeah.
another fad diet that you want to like talk about, let us know in the comments and we can kind of come up with another video for that.
Mhm.
Now let's go
Yes.
into the banned ingredients. I know you mentioned before we started recording this to read what this person asked us about.
Yes.
So I'm gonna read it and then we can kind of talk about it.
Yeah.
I actually haven't done any research on this, so this is gonna be for me too. So
Yay.
she asked, why do other countries have ingredients banned that we have in the States? If we're supposed to believe all foods fit, is our food in the US actually bad for us?
Which I think is a wonderful question. And there's a few different perspectives on this, which I found also interesting. Because, yes, this is one of those topics where, like, there's a lot of different research on it. And yeah, I'm excited to go into it. So, just broadly, I think we have to think about a lot of these ingredients, I'll say, are mostly banned in the EU. So a lot of times we don't
Okay.
see like in outside of the EU, we don't see those same type of bans. So well, let's kind of place this in the context of the bans in the EU, which is the European Union, versus what's allowed in the US. So if we take that lens, let's just think kind of more broadly about the EU versus the United States. And one policy difference between this country and then that group of countries is that in Europe, there's more of a perspective of freedom from certain things. So they have this
Hmm.
idea of promoting freedom from, whereas in the US, our perspective on policy is freedom to. So I'll kind of
Hmm.
explain how that looks when it comes to food policy. So in the
Hmm.
US, basically the way that we kind of view food policy is unless there's research to show that ingredients are going to actively harm us, then those
Hmm.
ingredients they can go in food, right? We have to see evidence that those are going to harm us in a like broad, decisive way. So they're going to cause this thing exactly for them to be banned. Whereas in
Hmm.
Europe, that freedom from shows up as if we don't know if this is going to be good or bad, it's banned. So if there's not research in any direction,
Oh.
you're not going to
Oh.
include it. So does
Okay.
that,
Interesting.
that's the
I
broader
feel like that can be so many
difference.
things.
I know, I know. There's like, and where personally, a little personal anecdote. So, for the viewers, my boyfriend is French, and he said part
Hmm.
of where this came from, some of the scare around, which I'll talk about GMOs specifically, because that's one big difference between the US and Europe, is that at the time when people were first starting to learn about GMOs, was also the same time that a lot of people were coming down with mad cow disease. And so he
Hmm.
said, kind of this frenzy around people getting mad cow disease was like, oh my gosh, it's because of the way our food is produced. We have to stop this. And again, it's kind of the way in which journalists have taken information and presented it to the masses that have affected how they see these different aspects of our food system. So
Hmm.
that's one thing to think about too with these type of questions, is that there's often a historical context to it as
Yeah.
well that we have to keep in mind, which is why I love researching it. But it can be a lot for the average consumer to have to think about all of those things. So I can understand when you're like, oh my God, well, if this is banned there, ooh, isn't it bad for us? And I think what people often anecdotally again kind of reference is that when you go to Europe, for example, their cigarettes have like those warning labels,
Yeah.
really huge. There's like pictures of what you look like when you smoke, whereas here, not so much. And so it's like, well, if they're doing a better job at protecting us from
Hmm.
diseases at
Yeah.
large, that applies to food. And we just can't make that jump. We can't make
Yeah.
that jump.
Yeah.
But there's so that's kind of the main difference, I will say.
Hmm.
So I wanted to talk before I jump into, because GMOs is kind of a longer part. Were there any questions that you had based on that broader?
Usually, well, it's more anecdotal that I see, like basically on Reels. But it's the people that are like, oh, I went to Europe and I was able to eat pasta every day and not get bloated and like not gain weight. But then I came
Mhm,
back here and it was like this whole thing. And I
mhm,
can't eat
mhm,
gluten in the US, but I'm able to eat it in Europe. That's
mhm.
usually what I hear.
Yeah. And
like the different
again,
foods.
yeah, I think you said it well, is like that's anecdotal, and there's
Mm-hmm.
so many different factors that go into how we feel in one place versus another. Like if you're
Yeah.
in Europe as an American, you're probably on vacation. So you're probably
Yep.
less stressed. You're probably eating more intuitively because you're like, I'm in Europe, so I'm going to let myself have what I want. Might as
Mm-hmm.
well. You're like enjoying time with whoever you're traveling with, or you're exploring the sites on your own. So there's a lot of different reasons for which you might just be digesting food better
Yeah. You're
than when you're,
walking,
yes, you're
enjoying.
walking around, which, sometimes movement gets the digestion going more smoothly. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's just so many factors for why you probably feel better when you're eating
Yeah.
pasta in Italy versus pasta in your kitchen.
I
It's
know.
two different
That psychological
experiences.
piece too,
Yes,
right? That like stress or
exactly.
like actually
Yes.
seeing how your whole day goes
Yeah.
versus a day that you have like on vacation.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. And when
that has
you're
an impact.
eating pasta in the US, it's usually because you're like, I want to cook this meal pretty quickly. I'm going to just make it fast and watch it in front of the TV. You eat really quickly. You're
Mm-hmm.
not really paying attention to what you're doing. And all of a sudden you're
Yeah.
bloated because you're like, oh, well, I wasn't really paying attention to my hunger or fullness.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you're in Italy, they're serving you your appetizer, then you get your pasta dish and you're talking and, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's just a totally different experience. So it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also when you have that relationship with food of food is my way to relax, my way to celebrate, my way to anything like cope with stress, then
Mhm.
that also impacts how you eat the pasta because we're using that as an
Yes.
example. But if you approach it in that way, then that's also going to leave you feeling all sorts of ways. But also,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. The psychological piece is so much stronger than people give it credit for. And so I think that's
yeah,
a huge component of
true.
why we notice that difference. And so I'll go into GMOs. So basically, when we hear GMOs, I think it sounds like something really sciencey, like, oh my gosh, this was created in the lab. So it's like it's something that's totally foreign.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes what like GMOs actually are. So I'll give this example of corn, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a GMO corn plant may involve like taking the gene for a pest resistant, like one individual plant, and then taking a gene from like a corn stalk that's a little bit bigger and blending those, which you can do by breeding them together over several seasons, or we can do it in a lab more
Yeah,
quickly. And so it saves
yeah.
time and money, and we can feed more people more quickly. And so
Mm-hmm.
the reason that the US has kind of picked up on GMOs more than Europe has is because we also have a much bigger population to feed.
I always say that. I'm like, compare the size of Italy to the size of the United States.
Yes, 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 yes. We have
There's
so
so
many
many
more
different,
people to
yeah.
feed. So it makes sense that we want to grow corn that's pest resistant and larger. And not a lot of people like that. And so that's where you can kind of use your individual judgment. If you're like, I'm someone who prefers to not have a product that's genetically modified, I'm going to make my corn at home or buy it from a local farmers market. That is your prerogative. Like
Hmm.
you can do that. But what we don't want to do is say that GMOs are harmful, because they're not. They're
Yeah.
just taking like a process that can naturally occur in nature and doing it in a lab to save money and save lives. So we don't want to
Hmm.
moralize it because it's allowed many Americans to live.
Yeah.
And what we don't want to do is say like, okay, because something is GMO, its nutritional value changes. It doesn't. It's
Mm.
just changing like a gala apple to a pink lady apple, right? Like that
Yeah.
change doesn't really change the nutritional content of the apple. It's just a different type of apple. So
Yeah.
that's how we kind of want to understand GMOs is it's yes, there's modifications, but it's something that could already naturally be occurring. We're just speeding it up for the sake of saving lives.
Exactly.
You could also say that the corporations and farmers who are producing this, it also helps them make money. So we'll name that as well as that.
Yeah.
Yes, they want to produce more because they want to make money. And I think that's where a
Hmm.
lot of people kind of get stuck too, is like, oh, this is just the US trying to make us sick or corporations trying to make us sick. And while generally, yes, I'm anti-corporation, this is actually a case in which it also allows a lot of people to live and live healthily because they normally
Yeah.
wouldn't have access to that apple or that corn or whatever it may be.
It's keeping up with the supply, the
Yes.
demand, the demand.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 And it's a
And I think,
technological advancement.
and I think also, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't it be like, for example, well, I don't know, this might just be me talking out of my butt, but wouldn't it be the same thing over time? Like things already mix. Like there's different fruits that are already like a natural mix from two
Mm-hmm.
plants that you're like, oh my God, this
Yes.
is so cool.
Yes.
And that happened naturally. It's just that you're doing this to, again, like you mentioned, kind of speed up the process. But it's not like
Yes.
this crazy, like Frankenstein thing that people are doing. Like this is
Exactly.
already happening in
Yeah.
nature. It's just that they found a way to kind of do it
Do it more
themselves
quickly.
in order to keep up with the demand.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think it's funny because you'll probably find at your farmer's market where a farmer did an experiment and he's combining like well, I think I forget which one citrus fruit it is, but it's like a tangerine and a mandarin. I don't know. There's two citrus fruits that they blend
Uh-huh.
together and we call them like I know they're not cuties, but we like call them cuties, right? So
Yes, they're so
in some
good.
yeah. In some instances we're like, yeah, this is great. That is a genetically modified fruit, you know? And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we praise them as like this is cute and fun and like how creative. That's essentially what we're doing with GMOs more widely. So
Yeah,
yeah,
true.
it's a natural process that's just being sped up in a lab, which
Mm-hmm.
isn't inherently good or bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember read an article about like this old man. I don't remember when, but where, but he created, I think like 100 types of different apples by basically doing that.
That,
It
yes,
was like him with
yes.
his pictures of like his 100 apples, and I'm like, there you go. That's like a
GMOs.
place everyone's like, wow, that's so cool. And I'm like, no,
Yeah.
people are doing that. Like that's
Yes.
pretty normal.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a normal part of our production process. I think people just get nervous about the scale at which it's being done. And when you hear,
Yeah.
I think the way you said it is perfect. Like we sometimes view it as like a Frankenstein experiment. We're like, oh my God, these are
Yeah.
Frankenstein vegetables. It's like, no, no, it's just as cute and fun as the little farmer who's
Yeah.
doing it with his
It's
apples at home.
science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah. And I think the other thing too, outside of GMOs and just thinking about the difference between the US and the EU, really just governments in general, is that oftentimes these governments are just trying to weigh the risks versus the benefits of any sort of like food policy, right?
Hmm.
So another example that I found was the additives nitrates and nitrites. So we hear a
Hmm.
lot about those, especially in like cured meats and hot dogs, about how those are carcinogenic. And so it's
Hmm.
like, well, why would you put those in meats and hot dogs if those could cause cancer? So great question, right? Of like, yeah, of course. Why would you think? And what the reason that those are in there in general is that the US food economy tends to lean towards having food that's free of pathogens. So when I say
Mm.
pathogens, that refers to any infectious microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, viruses, parasites. Like the US, when we're farming, we tend to not want to have those pathogens in our food because we don't want to have like infectious diseases taking out large swaths of the population. So those nitrites and nitrates are put into our food so that those pathogens can't get there. They prohibit the growth of
Mm.
pathogens, right?
Hmm.
So they're kind of weighing this risk and benefit of like, okay, well, if you take that out of those meats, you're going to be at risk for, you're a higher risk for foodborne illness and infectious
Hmm.
disease than if they're not there. But yes, there's some research to indicate that they could be carcinogenic again, like could be. So it's this weighing of the pros and cons of like, do we want to risk spreading infectious disease through our food or take this risk of possibly causing cancer? And that's something again that the individual consumer has to kind of
Yeah.
weigh the pros and cons of again. And so, and it's another thing to also think about, how does this just fit into the wider context of how I eat, right? Like
Hmm.
for the most part, most people aren't eating hot dogs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner like every
Hmm.
day of the week. So we also want to think about what's hard is what's referred to as like dosing. So
Hmm.
how much of this carcinogenic material is really in the hot dog, for example. I'm using that since it's just a classic example that's used a
Yeah.
lot. But we think about the dosing of how much do we actually need to eat before that becomes carcinogenic, which when we hear about these things in the media, all we hear is like, this causes cancer, but we don't know the exact amounts of like, how much do you need to eat before it causes us, like, it's a significant risk of causing cancer and that sort of thing. So and that varies person to person because we all have our own environments that we live in. We all have our predispositions towards certain types of cancer. So it's really hard to make these blanket statements that this causes cancer when we just don't know all of the factors that go into it. And we also
Yeah.
know that not including those things definitely causes infectious disease if there's pathogens that infiltrate those foods. So I thought that was really interesting to learn more about as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Like they can't be like this causes cancer if you eat it every day for 20 years, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah.
And also, if we don't do this, we can like kill a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like that little
Yeah.
asterisk, like they can't add that.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I wish
Yes.
they could,
I
but yeah.
know. Yeah. And one thing I also found interesting when I was kind of doing more research on this is that there's like a wide range of foods that have like carcinogenic agents in it, including fruits and vegetables. Like,
Hmm.
depending on how much broccoli that you eat, there could be carcinogenic
Like
like
naturally.
yes. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, which it's totally dependent on dosing. So I'm not saying stop eating
Yeah.
broccoli if you like broccoli, keep eating your broccoli. It's just
The
to prove
title of the
that
episode, don't eat broccoli. You're gonna get cancer.
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Honestly,
but
and
that's a
that's
good
that's
point. Yeah.
that's a type of thing that someone could read and be like, "Oh my God, I have to stop eating broccoli." No, it's just that in large quantities of broccoli over
Yeah.
time, that might cause cancer. So I think it just goes to show, again, we kind of zoom out and think about our relationship with food. Having a wide variety of foods in general is really important, but not
Hmm.
fixating on a certain diet pattern or certain foods to exclude because you can find something for anything, basically,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
the
You really
summary of that.
can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. All right. So GMOs.
GMOs, we talked about other pathogens, nitrates, nitrites. BHA is also one of those additives. So yeah, I think that covers banned foods, like why foods would get banned in other countries if you primarily for those two reasons. Or like I said, if like the EU doesn't have research to show it's not harmful, they often just say can't include this ingredient. So
Got it.
that's
Got it.
kind of
Got it. They're just
that.
like, let's eliminate it
Yeah.
altogether
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah.
actually, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why. Let me reread the question just to see if we
We
answered
got
it. Why do other
everything.
countries have ingredients banned that we have in the States? Yeah. If we're supposed to believe all foods fit, is food in the US actually bad for us? No.
So, yeah, the answer is
All foods
no.
can
Yes,
fit.
all foods can still fit, thank goodness.
I
Um,
know. They're actually trying to protect us from illness.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. But difference in perspectives too. Like if you are more on the side of I want everything to be banned until proven safe, then maybe the European lifestyle is something you
Yeah.
would find interesting to explore. So again,
Hmm.
because I think just in general, you and I were talking about just not demonizing any one way of
Yeah.
approaching food. So I say that just to say like that has its own benefits of doing it that way. It's just different. Neither is better than the other.
Yeah. 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 And I think don't let fear guide you. I think
Yeah.
it can get very like black or white, like,
All or nothing.
yeah. Because even me that I know about these things, sometimes I'm like, I read a headline, I'm like, oh, and they're like, wait, no, Danny, chill, like, relax. Like, you know what,
Yes.
you know.
Yes,
But
yes, yes,
still, I even had a
yes.
friend that was like, no, GMO. Like, she was so adamant about
Yeah,
GMOs. And I had
yeah,
another friend who's like a chef too, and like we know about like all these things. And we kept looking at each other and we're like, are we crazy? Because we were like,
yes,
no, there's, I just wouldn't, I was like, I don't get what. And she was
yeah,
unable to like explain why. And I was like, but
yes,
why?
yes,
She's like,
yes, yes,
no
yes.
GMOs. And I was like, am I going nuts? Because you start to doubt yourself because
Yes,
it's hard. It's hard to
it
kind of,
is.
because it's also going into it, like you mentioned, like something so specific.
Yes. Yes.
instead of it being more nuanced and more generalized and
Yes.
more taking a step back and
Totally.
informational.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like I remember learning about this in grad school, the GMOs. And over time, when people stop asking you about these things, you're like, you kind of forget what the science is behind it. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's why I was like, I know that like GMOs aren't bad, but I forget the mechanism as to why. And so you have to refresh your memory. And you
Yeah.
also have to kind of re-research depending on what aspect that someone's bringing up, because we might get to a place where it's like, okay, we believe that GMOs are acceptable, but what about this part of it? And so then you have to go do
Mm-hmm.
your research on that aspect of it. So
Yeah.
I think that goes to the larger point of like diet culture is always iterating too, of like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, we debunked this, what's the next what is that thing, whack-a-mole, right? What's the next thing that's
Yeah.
going to come up
That we
that
can hyper focus on.
yes, right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
It's
So
hard.
yeah.
I'm happy we're doing this episode.
Yes, yes. Even for
Yeah.
me, even for dietitians, we got to keep our like keep learning about these things, you know?
Yeah. 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 All right. So that was banned ingredients.
Yeah. So now we're moving on to this myth of not eating past a certain time at night.
Mm-hmm. This
So
is a popular one.
yes,
For
yes. And
like
I
7
think
p.m.
no, no, no. When the sun
Body's
sets,
closed.
so does the kitchen. Um
My stomach is out of commission.
yeah. Which I think is interesting because I think part of this rule comes from like moms who are done cooking past a certain time of night.
Yeah.
They're like, once dinner is served, the kitchen is closed, you know, and part of me thinks, I don't know how true this is, but that rule comes from like people being like, well, if my mom said we couldn't eat past a certain time, there must be a
Yeah.
biological reason for that. And it's like, no, she was just tired and she wanted you to stop asking her to make food.
She was done.
Yes.
That's
So,
funny.
no, this rule is kind of like a brother or sister or cousin of intermittent fasting, of like,
Yeah.
okay, past a certain time, your body can no longer digest food. So you have to stop eating, which is just not true. Like, our body can digest food at all times of the day, and it continues digesting food when we're asleep, maybe not as efficiently when we're asleep as when we're awake. But if you're
Hmm.
awake and you are hungry, that is your body asking for food. Or if you're
Yeah.
awake and you're having a craving, it's really important to let yourself have that food, because as soon as you restrict, we know what that leads
Hmm.
to, which is
Yeah.
just that negative cycle of, well, screw it, I'm just going to go for everything that I want now, versus just let yourself have that meal or snack when the time is
Hmm.
right. And so I think that is super interesting. And there has been some research done into like eating according to your circadian rhythm, but it's
Hmm.
it's the same thing as like what we find with keto and intermittent fasting, where it's really short-term studies. They don't account for what is it called, the other factors, that compounding variables. They
Hmm.
don't think about that. So like one of the studies that they were doing this with is night shift nurses. So they're like, well, like we saw these effects in nurses who work the night shift, but when we think about night shift nurses as yes, think about your night shift nurse in your life and what her life is like outside of the hospital. It's
If you've ever
hard.
worked night shift,
Yes. Okay. Yes.
oh my gosh,
Any night shift worker, you know that if there's something going on with your health, it's likely not due to the food that you're
a
eating, and more the
thousand
fact
percent.
that you're staying up when your body really wants to be asleep. Like that is
Hmm.
the challenging part. And so a lot of times what they'll find when they're doing research around stopping eating past a certain time is that basically restricting. So the
Yeah.
effects of restriction are the effects that they are, right? So they'll find that
Hmm.
like in the short term, yes, restriction might work in the very short term for weight loss. But in the
Hmm.
long term, it just leads to disordered eating and weight regain, and often gaining more weight long term because you just added another layer that's hurt your relationship with food. So
Exactly.
That's one thing that they found. And there was something else interesting. Oh, and with these night shift nurses as well, some of them we expect, like, okay, if they're a night nurse or a night shift worker, you're going to come home and sleep during the day, but often they
Mm-hmm.
don't. So
Yeah.
they need more food to keep up with the length of their day. And so,
Yeah.
yes, during that time in their life, they might gain weight, but that's probably
Mm-hmm.
protective for them because
Yeah.
they're leading a very stressful life and schedule. So
Yeah.
there are just so many factors that kind of make those studies around eating according to our circadian rhythm like not
Mm-hmm.
very applicable to large swaths of the population living their normal lives.
Yeah. And think about like the psychological factors, like you mentioned. Like, if you, number one, if you say it's 7 p.m. and kitchen is closed or my
Yeah.
stomach is closed and you're hungry and you're craving something, there's only so much amount of time that you're going to be able to white knuckle it.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
maybe you end up not eating for one night, maybe 2 nights, whatever that is. But the third night,
Yeah.
that's going to end up like you're going to give up. There's going to be
Yeah.
a time where instead of not eating or instead of eating like a snack or whatever that is, you're going to end up eating way more
Yeah.
because you're going to get the screw-its and be like, you know what, whatever. I can't do
Yeah.
this anymore.
Yeah, and it's also just impractical if you want to have a healthy social life, which research does show that having a healthy social life is one of the most important factors for your health, your overall
Yeah.
health, is
Mm-hmm.
social health being like nice and robust. And so if you're like, well, I only eat until 7 p.m., how are you going to go out and get dinner with your friends or
Mm-hmm.
have festive occasions where everyone's sharing food all hours of the night? Like that is actually much more helpful for your health to be involved in those
Yeah.
type of events than to be like, oh, this is kitchen is closed after 7 p.m. so I can't come out to eat with you guys. Like
Yeah. That
that's going
food
to negatively
rule.
impact you.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then also, at least for someone who's had like past struggles with food and has had like that night shift work that I
Mhm.
don't go to sleep. I used to like literally work a shift, another shift after. But think about like the emotional eating. You're extra tired, you're extra stressed,
Yes.
you don't know how to cope with it, and food is usually your go-to, then yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense that you're gonna turn to it to fill those
Oh,
needs.
yeah. Yeah,
That's gonna
totally.
help. Food
Yeah.
works. Like food makes you
Yeah.
feel really good.
Yeah.
So if you're extra tired, extra stressed, having to do so many things in your life, overwhelmed, then yeah, food is gonna come in and like help you
Mhm.
out. So if
Yeah.
you're trying to
Yeah.
again heal that relationship with food, think about that aspect of it, of how's that
Yes.
really gonna impact you in the long run.
Yeah. And I think too, when we are using food to cope in that way, like you're living a stressful life, you're working double shifts, you have a lot on your plate. A lot of times you might be in school. We know a lot of people that were working night shifts while they were in school. And
That's
so
me.
yeah, it's not the food that's the problem, right? It's not like, oh, well, if I
Exactly.
just had more self-control, then I wouldn't have this problem. It's like, no, you're in a really tough situation right now. And so are there other factors in your life that we can make life less stressful instead of
Yeah.
demonizing the food here? Because the food is doing nothing wrong other than trying to support you through those night
Yeah.
shifts.
The food is like, listen, I'm here.
Yeah.
Here for you. And you're like,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, it's not the food's fault. It's the fact that you're working double
Yeah.
shifts and going to school
Exactly. And
and,
you're tired.
yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
totally. All right, not eating past certain times. That was a good
Um,
one. Anything else
um,
on that?
trying to think if there was anything else. I think that's that. But if you have more questions, put them in the comments again. If there's any
Yeah.
aspect of it we didn't get to, tell us. We'll come back to it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And our next one is, should you use like apps to track your food intake? Should you be calorie counting? So this one is kind of similar to the last in that ultimately it's a food rule of I
Yeah.
should be keeping track of everything that I'm eating. And this app is going to tell me exactly how much I need to eat. And it's going to give me a lot of data about the types of foods that I'm eating. And here's the thing is that we are not robots. And so there is no app that can track perfectly what our body's needs are. It just can't. There's unfortunately and also beautifully, our bodies cannot be boiled down to just like machines that
Yeah.
AI can tell us exactly how we need to eat. And also when the databases by which those apps are getting their information are I don't want to say inaccurate, but they're not completely accurate, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Not
So
100%.
yes, like the way
Yeah.
that they're getting caloric information, for example, is an estimate. It's an
Yeah.
estimate, and it's not uh a lot of times, like let's say we're eating an apple, right? The energy of the apple you get is going to be different than the apple I get from my grocery store. It's just so,
Hmm.
there's so much variation in the way that those things are tracked that it really can't give us all the information that we need, even if we were like down to the detail trying to track everything that we were doing. It's just
Yeah.
inaccurate.
Even food labels, no?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
that's where it starts, and that's where they get their information from, is those food labels. But
Hmm.
it's they can't really tell us like, this serving of this is exactly going to provide you with this much energy. It's
Hmm.
just an estimation.
Yeah.
So a lot of times that's what they're using for their data. And then we add on top of that. So we know that that's not completely accurate. We know that those apps can't tell us how many calories that we need per day, which they
Hmm.
claim to be able to do. And similarly, we talk about this a little bit in when we think about how BMI is flawed. A lot of that information that they're basing that information on, a lot of the research is based on like a white male Eurocentric population.
Yeah.
So their recommendations for how many calories that someone should be getting is coming from such a small percent of the population. It does not account for like so many people,
Yeah.
so many parts of the world like cannot
Yeah.
use that information. So the apps are flawed. And then we think about how that affects our relationship with food, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the biggest piece. It's just like when you're having to track everything that you eat, it changes the way you eat, often in a negative way, right? Because you're like,
Hmm.
either you're like, I don't want to have something because then I'm just gonna have to log it. So you restrict your food intake, or you go into the screw-its again of like, well,
Yeah.
I don't want to log this. So I'm just gonna have everything that I can because that didn't work. My logging didn't work for the day. So it sets you up for such a feeling because no one has failed themselves, but a feeling of failure of like, well, if I
Hmm.
can't log everything meticulously, then might as well not at all and go
Yeah.
crazy, just like have everything I want. So it really harms our relationship with food because we're thinking of food as like, okay, it's just this formula. I have to plug it into my phone, and makes it really
Hmm.
difficult to really tune into what do you want to eat, about how much. Let's say you plate something for yourself and it's not quite enough. Like, do you have to
Yeah.
add that you put
Yeah.
one more scoop of this to your log, and how do you log that?
Or it doesn't fit in the log. Like you're
Yeah.
like, oh no, like I want
Yes.
more chicken and I know I'm
Yes.
hungry for the chicken, but it's gonna put me over.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And let's think about the other direction as well. Like let's say you're eating and you feel full and you haven't finished your plate and you're like, but I logged
Yeah.
this. Now do
Yeah.
I go back and how do I unlock? No, like the
Yeah.
logging is
Yeah.
not helpful.
Yeah. I remember when I was really young doing the Special K diet, and it was like
Special
breakfast
K.
Special K and dinner for Special K.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know what I was doing. I just remembered this. My sister was like, Daniela, she was like, if you're not hungry, you don't have to eat it. And I was like, oh,
See?
like
It like
this is
so disconnects
mind
you.
blowing.
Yeah.
And that's when I started to be like, wait, what am I doing? This is so
Yes.
stupid. But yeah, it's
Yes.
true. It's like these rules, and you're like, oh, I have to follow it to a T, whatever that is. And then you're
Yes.
like, well, I just have to eat cereal even if I don't want it, or even if I'm not hungry. And
Yes.
it's like, no, you just have to,
Yeah.
because we
Because
were also, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, when let's say you have this plate of food, you're like, I'm at an 8, I'm feeling good, but I don't know when I can eat again because I have this allotted amount of calories per my day. And so I better just finish this now because what if I get hungry later? Like it brings up that
Yeah.
nervousness of like, what if I'm hungry later and I can't have more because I have this limit set, this arbitrary limit. Let me
Yeah.
have it now, instead of being like, no, just pay attention to how you're feeling in the moment. So
Yeah.
it can really screw you up in so many ways.
Yeah. Like eating Special K when you don't want it. But
Yes.
also, if we're talking about like that, we were talking about that trust aspect of it, right? Of like returning to you to trust yourself right now.
Yeah.
Because I talk about this in the course, right? It's like external cues versus internal cues. These
Hmm.
apps, you're just following this external cue, which there's other
Yes.
external cues that you can follow, right? Like
Right.
time, whatever that is.
Right.
Um, But you're turning to them as external cues, but you're forgetting about your internal cues. You're
Yes,
not listening to
yes.
you because you're like, oh, I can't trust myself with food. So I'm gonna do
Yeah.
what this app tells me to do. And then you
Yes,
ignore that like
the
aspect
internal cues.
of yourself. So then you lose trust
Yeah.
in yourself and then you feel out of control. And then there's just like zero trust with yourself.
Yes,
So what we
yes, yes,
work
yes.
on doing is saying, okay, calorie counting might be enticing for you right now, but let's learn more about you. What do you want? What do
Yeah,
you need? How can you build these internal cues
yeah,
so that you don't need this external cue to tell you kind
yeah.
of what to do?
Yeah, exactly. And I think along with that, when we are so reliant on external cues, it takes up
Yeah.
so much time. I don't know if I mentioned that yet, but having to
Yeah.
log
Yeah.
everything every day is so time consuming. It versus really listening to yourself. You listen, you check in, which I'm not saying this is an easy process for people who are
You're
just
right.
learning how to check in.
Just check in.
Just check in, figure out what you
That's
want and eat
it.
it. No, it's hard when you're first starting to do that. But when you've gotten into the practice of it, it's it takes so much time off of your plate to not have to log in these apps
Yeah.
anymore. And I remember, so my experience with it was I had a class in college where we were supposed to use an app to track what we were eating for that week. And for me, I was like, first of all, in college, like most of the things that they give to you, it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
this casserole at the dining hall. Like I was
Yeah.
a full dining hall eater. I had a meal plan. So I remember going to the dining hall and being like, how do I log an enchilada casserole? Like what,
Yes. That's so
how do I
true.
do this? And so that, or if I'd go out to eat, it would be like a local restaurant. I was like, is this similar to Jimmy John's or Jersey Mike's? Like, it's just so confusing. So, on top
Yeah.
of trying to figure out, like, okay, I'm going to have to take time off from enjoying the sandwich with my friend to log
Hmm.
this so I don't forget it. Cause then if you get to your end of your day and you have to log, you're like, oh man.
Also, like, what does 2 ounces of deli
Yeah.
turkey look like?
Yeah. Do I ask the person? I'm like, is that 2 ounces?
Yeah. That
What is
squirt of
that?
mayo, was
Yeah.
that one
Would you
tablespoon?
estimate?
Quarter cup? I don't know. But
Imagine.
it's
That would
true.
actually
They're
be
making
a
it, and you're
fun,
like, how much is that?
that'd be a fun skit to make up like an SNL skit of
Yeah.
bringing your fitness
The
pal to
lunch
Subway.
lady.
The lunch
You're
lady.
like,
Yes, asking your lunch lady, what's in
yeah,
this? What's in this
yeah.
food? I
That
have to log in my
mystery
fitness pal.
meat,
Yeah.
what is that? What percentage of fat is
Yes.
it?
So
She's
yeah,
like, honey, I don't
it's
know.
relying on
Yeah.
external cues disconnects you from your body, leads to more distrust, disordered eating. Just get rid of the apps. Get rid of the apps. And
Yes.
generally, like I think this speaks to like, and this could be another conversation too, another whole video about our this trend towards biohacking of like biohacking our bodies, of like tracking not just
Closing the
food,
rings.
closing the rings, which I think people have stopped doing, which is funny because that was such a fad for a long time of like, and then
Yeah.
competing with your friends of how many rings you had to like, oh my gosh, maybe people still close their rings. I don't know. But I remember that being a trend.
Hmm.
Now with the Aura ring, it's like, how exactly how much sleep I'm getting. And
I know.
I can recognize as someone who struggles with sleep, that is so tempting. That is so tempting to get something that can tell you how much you're sleeping. But the reason for which I don't do that, and I think it can be harmful, is because it can just increase your anxiety of like, when I
Hmm.
wake up and I don't know exactly how much I slept, I'm like, I'm going to assume based on how I feel, what type of night that was. If
Yeah.
I were to see that on like my phone of like, Julia only got 2 hours of sleep, my whole day would change
True.
dramatically, right? Like I'd be
Even if
like,
you feel better.
yes, yes,
Yes.
yes.
That's so true. I
So
never thought about it that way.
which again, with these things, like if that works for you, if tracking your sleep has improved your
Right.
sleep, go for it. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that when we rely on these external cues to guide how we eat, sleep, move, it really disconnects us to how we're feeling.
Yeah.
It's like we cannot rely on, whereas, like, if I rely on, let me just see how I feel today. If I need a nap,
Hmm.
I'll take a nap. If I don't, I don't. And I won't really
Yeah.
make decisions based on what my watch or ring has told me to do. So I
Mm-hmm.
think this just speaks to like a cultural shift of trying to like make everything about us just run through a computer, when
Mm-hmm.
like the best way to improve our quality of life is to tune in to how we're feeling and what our
Yeah.
body is asking for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also it's like, it's not, I know it's so enticing, right? It's so like
Mm-hmm.
sexy and oh my God, I'm
Yes.
gonna know exactly, I don't know how many steps I got.
Yes.
But then also, it's like there's also this aspect of the way that you're living it's like you're your own Tamagotchi.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
where do you come in? Do you know
Yes.
what I mean? That you have this ring and you're
Totally.
like tracking, and then you're like, oh my God. And okay, yeah, cool. You can,
Uh-huh.
and again, even with anything that we talked about, there's probably
Yeah.
people that it works for them. That's
Yeah.
fine. Long
Yeah.
term, I don't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
But how does this impact you,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
the person that you're comparing yourself to,
Yeah.
or you're comparing yourself to your Aura ring, whatever that is,
Yeah.
it might like the story that you're telling yourself about them might not be what you think.
Yes. Yes.
You
Yes. Yes. Yes.
know, they might
Yes.
not have food rules. They might be super flexible, and maybe that's why calorie counting works for them.
Yeah.
Right? You're seeing the only like the counting and the rigidity and all the things,
Yes.
or you're seeing the rings close, you're seeing they wear an Aura ring and you're seeing how they follow all these things, but maybe in the
Mhm.
back end they're like, I don't care. Right? Maybe
Yeah.
they find a way that actually works for them. That's like no big deal because they
Yeah.
don't make it like this rigid food rules, all of these perspectives and beliefs that they
Yeah.
have from growing up
Yeah.
and their life. So you
Yeah.
can't really compare. You can't really
Yeah.
generalize it so much.
Yeah. And even if I think there are some instances where some people have kind of accepted that their lives are going to be ones that are controlled by their watch, right? Like that's
Yeah.
what they've accepted for themselves. They're spending time on that, and that's like their life. But oftentimes, and probably if you're watching this video, you've gotten to a point where you're like, I am so stressed by the way that I eat and the
Yeah.
expectations around food in my body. I can't do it anymore. And if you're in that place, that makes total sense. And tuning into your body is going to be way more effective at finding that peace that you're looking for than,
Hmm.
like you said, kind of treating yourself as a Tamagotchi, being like, oh, let me just throw
Yeah.
some things at it right now. Right. Like
Yeah.
really treating yourself as like, no, when I look inward from that nurturing perspective, what do I really need? Not just like, what does the
Yeah.
Tamagotchi need right now?
What does this list tell me that I need?
Yes.
Instead of like, wait, no, I just need a nap and I'm like super stressed. So let me go
Yes.
handle that in another way or in a way that can be more effective and helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think,
Yeah.
like you said too, it's tempting, it's sexy to be like, let me find the perfect app and formula, and then I won't have to think about there's that mirage of I won't have to think
Yeah.
about food ever again if my watch can do it for me. And it's like,
Hmm.
actually, no, the reverse. The
Yeah.
reverse happens
Yeah.
of you become way obsessed with it instead of not having to think about it. So I think that's another important point to bring up.
True.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Like the easy fix of like the sexiness of like, well, I think also what we were talking about, like the identity piece, right? Like, oh, I'm just gonna do this, and then this is gonna go this way, and it's gonna be great, and da 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 da. And then it's like, wait a second, I'm thinking about food so much more,
Yes.
and I'm thinking about like
Yes.
the food guilt, and I'm worried, and it's like,
Yes.
what does this mean about my body? And this is why I
Yeah.
started it, and it's not working out how I want to. So
Yes.
now, all of that
Yeah.
comes from that.
And the health anxiety too of like, well, I'm eating on all these certain ways. So then when something does happen to you, because inevitably, like there are people who eat according to how every influencer has told them, and they still might come have a negative health outcome. And then they're
Yeah,
like, well, then there's something just deeply flawed with me. It's no, no. It
yeah,
unfortunately, disease is an unfortunate aspect of being a human. And so
yeah,
sometimes that can happen without any individual like decision that you made or didn't make, causing
yeah,
that.
yeah. Yeah, there are certain things that you really just can't control, and I think
Yeah.
a lot of times food makes us feel very in control.
Yes,
So it's
totally.
also
That's the
realizing that.
thing. Yeah, is
Yeah.
that there's those pieces of life that historically we've been accepting of this is out of our control that more recently, especially with the rise of the internet, we're like, now we can figure it out. Now we can be in control. And unfortunately, our bodies are still the same bodies that still have the same functions that they did,
Yep.
where there's aspects that are out of our control. And that's hard. That's a hard thing for us to kind of sit with and be like, yeah, that might happen to us. And I can't do anything about it. Like that can bring up anxiety, and learning how to sit
Yeah.
with that discomfort is really important.
Exactly. 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 Yeah, that's part of the work. That's
Yeah.
part of the work. Like
Yes. Yes.
learning
Yes.
how to let
Yes.
go of that
Yes.
false sense of control. But
Yes.
yeah,
Hmm.
huge things. Yes. All right.
Yes.
So that was apps to track calorie counting,
Yeah.
external versus internal cues. Now we're going to go to the last one.
Superfoods.
Superfoods.
So generally, we're going to talk about this belief that there
Yeah.
are these superfoods that we need to be including in our diet because they are going to make us pure and healthy and clean eating. I say that facetiously. And so, yeah, these foods that we're told, which I think it's also interesting because those superfoods can change over time of like
Yeah.
what they are, what the emphasis is.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, this idea that there are certain foods that we need to eat that are going to be the elixir for our health,
Mm-hmm.
right? The
Yeah.
magic thing. Which I think, as you and I were talking about it, different things that we came up with could be like foods that actually have benefits like antioxidants, but they
Mm-hmm.
get touted as like this is the be all end all. Again, kind of going back to our blueberry story of if you
Yeah.
don't have these all the time, you're not doing enough to decrease your risk of cancer, right?
Yeah.
That or different types of powders, different. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what comes up a lot.
Spirulina. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, yeah. Goji
yes,
berries. I'm
yes.
just
Athletic
literally,
greens.
my dad drinks a smoothie every single morning of like superfoods, and I'm just naming the ingredients that are in there.
Which
I'm
when
like,
I think of it, I think of the athletic greens, which don't come after us. I
yes.
don't think they'll come after us
I
because we have a ton of
know.
followers, but don't come after us, athletic
Yeah.
greens. But when I see that, I'm like, oh man, yeah, it's that promise of if I just put this into my morning smoothie, it's that perception of control. Like
Yep.
this is going to be the thing that helps me get all the vitamins and nutrients that I need, and it's going to be the best, and it's going to help me heal.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's just no one food that is going to, prevent us from having these negative health outcomes, right? And
Mm-hmm.
being fixated on one food versus another, or I need to incorporate these during the week, is just going to lead again to restriction and disordered eating, which in
Yeah.
the long term negatively affects our health, leads to that rebound effect of like, at some point, you're going to want something other than blueberries or athletic greens
Yeah.
or goji berry, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just
Also, like if you don't
another.
like it, then you're gonna just be like miserable and kind of
Yes.
look at other breakfast foods or other foods like, oh
Yes.
my God, if only I could just have like eggs without any like weird things on it, I would be so happy. And
Yes,
now eggs
yes.
turn to like this glorified thing. But I think also it's like the perfect example, like we were talking about, where nutrition is hyper focused on one thing.
Yeah,
And it's like, okay, yeah,
it's
they
microscopic.
like this tagline of like superfoods and all the things. And it's like, okay, yeah, they probably have like a lot of great aspects to them, but it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you should have like, superfoods and everything, or it doesn't mean that you have to make it a
Yes.
food rule. You can have them, but
Yeah.
also look at nutrition and health with a broader aspect so that you
Yes.
don't fall into the same kind of
Obsessive.
tagline.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Rigid
that we've
eating
been talking about.
patterns. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there was something else I was going to say about superfoods in general. I don't remember, but we'll come back to it, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's largely it, is just this idea of like honing in the microscopic view of nutrition instead of zooming out and thinking about
Yeah.
how am I eating more generally? How am I eating patterns? Am I eating in a consistent way? Am I eating a wide variety of foods versus this one thing? Oh, I remember what it was.
Yay.
So I saw this tweet, and I think another thing that we can always keep our eyes out for when it comes to these superfoods is like how trendy it can be. Like you'll
hmm
probably see on social media certain foods and drinks that for a while, I feel like chia seeds were all the whole like
Yes,
big
chia
thing.
pudding.
Yes. And then
Yeah.
more recently, I haven't seen that as much. But one thing I also saw is like matcha and as something that people drink,
Yeah.
which totally fine if you like matcha. I know there are people who legitimately like it, but I saw a funny tweet yesterday that was like, drinking matcha tastes like you're eating like a freshly mowed lawn. And I was like,
It's
yes.
true though.
Yeah. Like it's so lawn tasting, like front lawn tasting after a
Freshly
fresh
cut.
cut.
I remember when we were working at OPC,
Yeah.
I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go to Starbucks and I'm gonna get a
Mhm.
matcha
Yes.
latte. And
Yeah.
I tasted it and I was like, this is disgusting. I
Yeah.
was like, why am I having this? And I think it was Angelica. She was like, you just have to put like a lot of sugar in it. And I was like, I'm not gonna like it.
What's
Like,
the
I'm not gonna
point?
enjoy
Yeah.
it. I
Yeah.
was like, I'll just stick to my coffee.
I
But it looks
know.
good too. I'm like,
It
oh, it looks really
does.
good.
That
And then
green
I have it. I'm
color.
like,
I know. That's the thing. I feel like so many people have probably had that same moment because I had that too, where I was like, oh my God, the green kind of looks like a fun smoothie, you know?
yeah, like a creamy. I'm like, oh, it
Yes.
looks so good. And then I tasted it.
Like
I'm like,
you almost expect like a pistachio,
you know
like
what? Yes.
that type of flavor. So I was like,
I'm
I'm
gonna
gonna
create a
try
pistachio
it.
latte. It's gonna be the next thing.
I
I'll
know,
call it a
superfood
superfood.
pistachio. So
Yeah,
I thought so
it's
too. And then I
true.
tasted it and I was like,
What
okay,
is
no,
this?
this
It
cannot be
tastes like
part.
sushi. It tastes like, I don't know. I was like, oh,
Seaweed, a
yeah, maybe
seaweed
it was the
drink.
type. Somebody was like, no, you
Yeah.
have to get like a good quality one. And I'm like, I give up. But
Yeah. I'm like,
it's
sorry,
true
but if it's,
though.
yeah, yeah, stuff like that, if it doesn't taste good to you, it's not a superfood. It's super
Yeah.
bad.
Just get something else. You're fine.
Yes.
You're literally fine.
It's okay.
I think
Have your
that's the thing. Like,
coffee.
yeah. No, now every day I have my coffee. I'm like, chill. But I think it's nutrition. People make nutrition. Okay. Nutrition can be fun.
Hmm.
It can
Hmm.
be really fun, entertaining, right? Like superfoods, chia recipes. Oh my God, I found this recipe where you can just like
Yeah.
blah, 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 right? You can have fun with it.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's just when you get into the taglines, when you get into the hyper focusing
Shoulds.
on it, the shoulds, the food rules, if you really look into it, it really impacts your relationship with food.
Yes.
And that is
Yes.
that. Like, if you're
Yes.
able to see it in a very neutral way, in a fun way, that you're how like super flexible, it's no big deal, and it
Yeah.
adds to your life. Oh my God, that's fine. Eat all
Yeah.
those, like my dad, have your smoothie with superfoods and
Yeah.
be like, oh, so
Do it.
amazing. Yeah. And he tries to give it to everyone, and everyone's like, oh God, no. He always makes them for my mom, like a little bit, and puts it in the fridge for her, and she never drinks
Oh,
it.
there's
And
like
he's like, I make,
five lined up for the week.
like, do you want it, Danny? I'm like, hell no, I don't want that thing. But
Yeah.
he's like, I give it to your mom every day. And my mom's like, I never drink
She's just pouring
it.
it behind the scenes. She's pouring it down the sink. He's like, yeah, it's
She's
so
like, I don't want
good.
that. Yeah. But it's true. Like, you can have
Yeah.
fun with it. There's nothing wrong with these things. It's also like not like a negative moral thing.
Yeah.
It's just to see how it impacts you.
Yes. And I
Not
think
good or
that
bad.
piece as well, to touch on a little bit more, is a lot of times these superfoods are super expensive. I'm just going to keep
Yeah.
using super in different contexts. Super bad. They're super expensive, right? Like
Yeah.
doing this, eating in that way is a privilege. And I think that's also the danger of labeling this as the good way to eat, the clean way to eat,
The
because
clean. Oh, we should have done clean
yes,
eating.
clean
That
eating
would have
could
been a
be its
good one.
own.
A whole episode on that.
Yes.
Yes, it's true
Yes.
though.
There's so
Think about
many
Whole
aspects.
Foods or what's it called?
Yes.
Erewhon.
Yes.
It's like
Yes.
a
Yes.
whole
Yes.
identity, whole yeah.
It's a whole identity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole
Yeah.
social, psychological aspect to it as well.
Yes. Even those the name Whole Foods, not that you can't shop there, but the name Whole Foods insinuating that there's a half food out there, there's a quarter
Yeah.
food. That's your like a different type of grocery
Yeah.
store is just like half pieces of food. It just,
Yeah.
yeah, there's so much morality tied into it. And inherently when we tie morality to food, we're also like assigning kind of a class value to it,
Yeah.
of where we're being classist of, oh, this superfood that I'm eating is better than these other foods that other people are eating, right? And
Yeah.
so that's the other danger with these superfoods is if you are purporting that they are so much better than every other types of food, which we know by research that they aren't, and
Yeah.
we know that those foods are only limited to people who have the money to afford them, we're also creating this really unfair system of only certain people get to access health, only certain
Yeah.
people. And so I
Yeah.
think that's the other piece we always want to have like a like discerning eye for is what is kind of the underlying message that we might be perpetuating by like spreading these taglines or these like quick and easy slogans of like this is a superfood for you, how harmful that can be for so many people, not just those who struggle with disordered eating, but those who have different access to food.
Yeah. No, imagine too, like what
Yeah.
you're doing to that person or to that person's kids, like what messages
Yeah.
you are delivering to them, and then
Yeah.
them going to like a regular grocery store and then maybe not buying certain things that would be
Yeah.
beneficial for them that they might need
Yeah.
because of these like taglines or because of this like fear
Yes.
mongering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So many things. I feel like we could talk
Yeah.
for
I
5 more hours.
know. I know. This was so good.
I know, I know. I definitely want to keep doing this.
Yeah.
I did write in the title, do this instead, right? Like the
Yeah.
five wellness myths. So what do you feel like if you would to give like one piece of advice of like what you can do instead for the
Yeah.
people that are watching?
I would say that in summary, like really tuning into your internal cues and relying
Yeah.
on those. Like, what do you want in the moment? What sounds good to you? And
Hmm.
make that for yourself. And then if you need a little bit of guidance, right? Like thinking about are you eating consistently throughout the day? So
Hmm.
I always
Hmm.
start, I don't know if you've heard the
Yeah.
acronym of RAVES before, but it's like the regular eating. So I'm like, okay, are you eating regularly? If you need some guidelines,
Hmm.
think about that. Are you eating regularly? Are you eating adequately? Generally, are you getting a variety of foods, which includes carbohydrates? Because a lot of people think
Hmm.
variety just means like colorful fruits and veggies. No, it also means fats and starches and grains.
Yeah.
Um, are you eating socially? Like, are you making an effort to build out your social life and eat in those
Yeah.
opportunities as well? And then are you eating spontaneously? Like, do you find it easy to say, let's drop everything and go get ice cream together, or let's go get sushi at 4 p.m.? Like, are you able to do that when your body says, I'm hungry at 4 p.m. for sushi? So
Yes.
instead of following these rules and these diets, like tune into your body. And if you need help tuning in, work with someone who can
Yeah.
help you with that. Like
Yeah.
that's sometimes it's really hard to know where to start, and that's okay. Like all of us started somewhere, and often we had to have a mentor or a coach or a therapist will guide
Yep.
us through this process. Like I can speak for myself here where I did not come across this on my own and be like, oh, yeah, this all makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm doing like I had to have guidance in getting to a place of intuitive eating. So
Hmm.
if you need that guidance, don't feel afraid to try to find help where you can, of either working with someone or find resources. You know, there's the intuitive eating book, there's videos
Yeah.
like this. Just, it's okay to need help with this aspect of your life.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think also kind of, I guess, check yourself with who you're following, what you are like that. I think like social media diet, I guess, like who you're following, what you're
Yes.
actually watching, what you're feeding your mind, because
Yeah.
that also matters. And
Yeah.
also if you do see these titles, these headlines, these like
Mhm.
fear-mongering things, okay, cool. Take it with a grain of salt and also know
Yeah.
that nutrition isn't that. Nutrition isn't
Yes.
something that is hard and hyper focused on this one
Yeah.
food and all the things and making, I don't know, like everything healthified. That's not nutrition. That is not
Yeah. Yeah.
nutrition, so don't fall into it. Nutrition is something broader, more flexible, more inclusive,
Mhm.
and honestly, I think at the end of it, a little bit easier. It's so
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Once
Yeah.
you're able to
Yeah.
go through like let's say you do Find Food Peace program, which you'd be working with us too, hey. But let's say you do this, by the end of that, you'll be able to use nutrition knowledge
Yeah.
in your everyday life and then just move on with your life instead of it
Yeah.
being like this like back and forth, not knowing what
Yeah.
to do, not knowing if you should eat superfoods or after a certain time. No, it's a lot easier than that and it's something that adds to your life
Yeah.
instead of it making it kind of stressful.
Yeah, it's a lot gentler, which is why I like the idea of gentle nutrition. It's just
Yeah.
it's gentler. And yeah, I to reiterate that, like, be careful of who you're following on social media and where you're getting your nutrition information. If you can, like, see if you're like, I really like following this one person, I like the way they present topics, see what their background is and see, like,
Yeah.
okay, what have they studied to get here to be able to share this information? Or if you're reading an article, one thing to think about, like you said, with nutrition, it's not like such a hard and fast topic. There's always nuance. So if you're reading a headline that isn't nuanced, likely that's a red flag. Like if it's like
Yeah.
says always, never, if it's all or nothing thinking,
Yeah.
it's likely not the full story. So that's something also to be aware of. And if you do enjoy reading research articles, go into the research, like look
Yeah.
up what they're referencing and see if what they're referencing is reliable in the sense of, is this a randomized controlled trial? Is it a large study group? What
Mm.
is the amount of time that they did the study for? Like you can, if that's what interests you, do your research and you'll actually kind of quickly be like, oh yeah, there's a lot more to this than what this article might be saying. So those are some
Yeah.
tidbits if you're really into to going deeper.
Yeah. Yeah. And also like I think sometimes we think like, oh, those are the experts. So you just like put all your trust in
Mm-hmm.
them
Mm-hmm.
instead of
Mm-hmm.
like actually like you're able to question things. You're able to be like, wait,
Yes.
that sounds a little bit excessive or that sounds a little bit
Yes.
too much or
Yeah.
whatever that is. Like also trust
Mm-hmm.
yourself with that and be like, okay, so I don't have to fully trust everyone on the internet. Like I can
Yeah.
also see what's best for me and see
Mm-hmm.
how I want to apply it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you hit on something really important, which is that we are the only nutrition experts for ourselves. If that
Yeah.
makes sense. So
Mm-hmm.
even with the clients I work with, I'm not their nutrition expert. I'm walking alongside them to learn
Yep.
more about their bodies and their needs, but we are our own experts ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's
Yeah.
something important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. 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 100%. Nobody can tell you like you have to eat at
This
3
is what you
p.m. and you
need.
have to eat this. Yeah. And you're like, I'm working
Exactly.
at 3 p.m. I can't
I
do
know.
that.
I'm in a phone call at 3 p.m. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
All right. Well, thank you, Julia. This
You're
is
welcome.
amazing.
I know. This was super fun.
Yeah. So
So,
if you have any more questions, any comments, any buts, put them in the comments. We're more than
yes.
happy to talk about them. I
Yeah.
do want to continue talking about different topics with you, Julia, so stay tuned because
Yes.
these will be coming hopefully more often.
Yeah.
And if you are looking for more support with actually working through the steps of healing your relationship with food, stopping binge eating, emotional eating, overeating, body image, you can work with me and Julia and find Food Peace group program. Let us know if you're interested in the comments or DM me. But yeah, anything else, Julia?
I think that's it. Yeah. If,
That's
like Danny said,
it.
if you need support, we're here. I'm glad that everyone had a chance to kind of meet with us and see how we think about things.
Yeah, I love that. Alrighty, thank you, Julia.
You're welcome.
Bye.